If you grew up in a sprawling American suburb in the early 2000s, you know the specific kind of silence that settles over a cul-de-sac right after the streetlights buzz to life. It's not a true silence. It's a humid, heavy quiet, underlined by the rhythmic hum of cicadas, the distant drone of a neighbor's central air conditioning unit, and the occasional muffled bark of a dog 2 blocks over. In those days, the neighborhood felt like an extension of our own living room. Safety wasn't something we thought about, it was just the default setting of our lives. We rode our bikes until the sun dipped below the horizon, drank water straight from the garden hose, and believed with the absolute certainty of youth that monsters only existed on the rented VHS tapes we watched on Friday nights. I was 8 years old, right in the thick of that golden, naive era, and I was suffering from a chronic, agonizing case of middle child syndrome. My older brother, Derek, was 12. He was the golden boy, the trailblazer, and most importantly to the context of this nightmare, a rising star in the local Boy Scout troop. Derek had the khaki uniform, a neckerchief secured with a brass slide, and a sash that was slowly but steadily filling up with merit badges. My parents beamed with pride every time he learned to tie a new knot or started a fire using nothing but flint and dry birch bark. Then there was my little brother, Mikey. He was 4. A toddler whose primary job was to be adorable and completely oblivious to the world around him. And then there was me, Leo, stuck in the middle, too young to join Derek's scout troop, but too old to be coddled like Mikey. My jealousy of Derek's scouting adventures was an all-consuming fire. When my mom would drag me along to the local middle school gymnasium for the annual Pinewood Derby, I would sit in the bleachers, clutching a Capri Sun, seething with envy as Derek and his friends raced their meticulously carved wooden cars down the aluminum tracks. I wanted the camaraderie, I wanted the badges, but more than anything, I wanted the campouts. Every few months, Derek's troop would pack up their gear and head out into the dense, sprawling woods of state parks for an entire weekend. I would watch from the front porch as he loaded his massive frame-supported backpack into the trunk of our dad's Ford Explorer. When they returned on Sunday afternoons, smelling of wood smoke, bug spray, and unwashed socks, Derek would regale us with stories of ghost hunts, roasted marshmallows, and sleeping under a canopy of stars. It sounded like pure magic. To prepare for these excursions, Derek was occasionally tasked with bringing a troop tent home to practice pitching it. Our backyard was the perfect training ground. We didn't live in a dense, fenced-in grid. Our house sat at the edge of a newer development, where the property lines were vague and the manicured lawns simply bled into one another before abruptly giving way to a dense, overgrown patch of dense Appalachian woods that separated our subdivision from the next town over. There were no 6-foot privacy fences to box us in. The transition from safe suburban grass to wild, untamed forest was immediate. It was a sweltering Friday evening in late July when the idea struck me. Derek had brought home a heavy-duty, forest green canvas tent to practice his setup time. He had wrestled with the aluminum poles and the nylon rainfly all afternoon, while I watched from the patio, eating a melting cherry popsicle. When he finally got it pitched, it looked like a sturdy little fortress sitting right in the middle of our expansive lawn, about 50 feet from the edge of the dark tree line. "Dad," I pleaded, following my father into the kitchen as he was pulling cold beers from the fridge, "can we sleep in it tonight, please?" My dad paused, looking down at me with an amused expression. "You want to sleep in the backyard? It's supposed to be hot tonight, Leo." "I don't care," I insisted, my voice bordering on a whine. "Derek gets to go camping all the time. It's not fair. I want to camp. We have the tent right there. We don't even have to leave the house." My mom, who was at the counter slicing watermelon, looked over her shoulder. "It might be fun for them, Tom. A little backyard campout. It keeps them out of our hair for the evening anyway." Dad sighed, closing the fridge door. "All right, but if you get scared and come inside at 2 in the morning, I'm not making you breakfast." I cheered and sprinting back outside to deliver the news to Derek. To my surprise, he was actually cool with it. At 12, I think he was starting to feel the itch of independence, and spending a night outside the house, even if it was only a few dozen yards from the back door, appealed to him. To give us the full experience, Dad dragged our heavy iron fire pit out to the center of the yard, placing it safely away from the tent and the dry brush of the woods. He gathered some firewood from the pile against the garage and got a modest blaze going as the sun finally began to sink, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. The evening was perfect. It was the kind of summer night that feels suspended in amber. The heat of the day broke, leaving behind a warm, comfortable breeze. Fireflies began to blink rhythmically in the dark spaces between the oak trees at the edge of the property. My parents brought little Mikey out, and we all sat around the crackling fire in cheap plastic lawn chairs. Mom brought out a platter of graham crackers, Hershey's chocolate bars, and a bag of jumbo marshmallows. We whittled the ends off of thin branches we found near the tree line and spent the next hour charring sugar over the open flames. Even Mikey got to participate, ending up with more sticky, burnt marshmallow in his blonde hair than in his mouth. For a brief, shining moment, I wasn't jealous of Derek. I was a camper. I was roughing it. I was a rugged outdoorsman, surviving in the wild. Provided the wild had Wi-Fi reaching the patio and a fully stocked refrigerator 60 feet away. By 9:30, the sky was a deep, bruised purple, giving way to the pitch black of night. The neighborhood grew profoundly quiet. The fire had died down to a glowing bed of orange embers, hissing softly as the occasional drop of dew hit the hot iron. "All right, boys," Mom said, standing up and brushing graham cracker crumbs off her jeans. "Mikey's practically asleep in his chair. Time for us to head in." "I want to sleep in the tent," protested Mikey, his eyes half closed and his voice thick with exhaustion. "Not tonight, buddy," Dad said, scooping the 4-year-old up into his arms. "You're too little for the tent. Maybe next year. Leo, Derek, you guys got everything you need?" "Yep," Derek said, zipping up his light fleece jacket. "If you need to use the bathroom, the back door is unlocked," Mom added, her maternal instinct kicking in. "Don't go wandering off into the trees in the dark, and keep the tent zipped up. The mosquitoes are going to be vicious tonight." "We know, Mom," I said, rolling my eyes with the performative annoyance required of an 8-year-old. "Good night, boys. Have fun," Dad said. They carried Mikey across the dark expanse of the lawn, their figures silhouetted by the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen windows. We watched the heavy glass sliding door pull shut, sealing them inside the safety of the house. The deadbolt clicked. Suddenly, the backyard felt a lot bigger. Without the chatter of our parents, the ambient noise of the night rushed in to fill the void. The crickets were deafening. The wind rustled the leaves of the towering oaks at the edge of the woods, making a sound like rushing water. "Come on," Derek said, breaking the silence. He clicked on a heavy-duty yellow maglite flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp path through the darkness. "Let's get set up." We crawled into the canvas tent. The air inside was stiflingly warm, smelling strongly of synthetic fabric and the stale, dusty scent of previous camping trips. Derek hung a small battery-powered lantern from a loop at the apex of the ceiling, bathing our little dome in a harsh white glow. We unrolled our sleeping bags on the somewhat lumpy ground. I had a faded blue one adorned with the logo of the local sports team, while Derek had a serious mummy-style bag designed for sub-zero temperatures. At that time in my life, the Game Boy SP was the pinnacle of human technology. As soon as we were settled, we both reached into our duffel bags and whipped out our respective consoles. The satisfying click of the screen flipping open echoed in the small space. Soon, the tent was filled with the 8-bit chiptune melodies of our games. I was deeply entrenched in Super Mario Bros. 2, endlessly frustrated by levels I could never quite memorize, while Derek was intensely focused on leveling up his party in Pokemon Emerald. For a while, it was great. It felt like a sleepover, but with the added thrill of being outdoors. We didn't talk much, just existed in the shared glow of our backlit screens, occasionally swatting at a rogue mosquito that had managed to sneak in before we zipped the door shut. But as the clock on my Game Boy crept past 11, the novelty began to wear off. The ground beneath my sleeping bag was unforgiving. I could feel every root, every pebble, every subtle dip in the soil pressing into my spine. The nylon sleeping bag, which had seemed cozy an hour ago, was now making me sweat profusely. The air inside the tent felt thick and stagnant. I powered off my console, the sudden silence jarring. "You going to sleep?" Derek asked, not looking away from his screen. "Trying to," I mumbled, shifting onto my side and pulling the bag up to my chin. "Good luck. It's hot as hell in here." I closed my eyes, waiting for sleep to take over, but it wouldn't come. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from staring at the small screen, but my mind was restless. Every time I was on the verge of drifting off, a sound would pull me back. A twig snapping in the woods, a distant car driving down the main road. The wind pushing against the taut canvas of the tent. Being outside the walls of the house stripped away a layer of security I hadn't realized I relied on. Inside my bedroom, I knew what every creak of the floorboards meant. Out here, every noise was a mystery, and in the dark, an 8-year-old's imagination is a vicious, terrifying thing. I laid there for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent. Derek eventually turned off his game, clicked off the overhead lantern, and plunged us into near total darkness. The only illumination was the faint, ghostly gray of the moonlight filtering through the fabric. I listened to Derek's breathing slow and deepen, shifting into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. He was out cold. I was entirely alone with the night. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore the discomfort in my back and the strange, unfamiliar sounds of the suburban wild. I just needed to fall asleep. If I went inside now, Dad would never let me hear the end of it. Derek would tease me forever. I had to tough it out. Eventually, the exhaustion won. The sounds of the crickets faded into a drone. The hard ground seemed to soften, and I finally, mercifully, slipped into an uneasy sleep. I didn't know it then, but when I woke up, my childhood, that profound sense of absolute suburban safety, would be gone forever. I don't know what woke me. There was no sudden noise, no jarring nightmare that sent me bolting upright in a cold sweat. It was a gradual, insidious transition from the dark void of deep sleep into a state of groggy, disoriented consciousness. It felt as though the heavy, humid air inside the tent had thickened while I slept, pressing down on my chest and making every breath feel like a chore. I blinked in the pitch blackness, my eyes struggling to adjust to an environment devoid of any ambient light, save for the sickly pale gray luminescence of the moon filtering through the nylon canopy. My mouth tasted like stale sugar and dust. My back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity from the unforgiving terrain of the backyard beneath me. The sleeping bag, which I had zipped all the way up to my chin in a futile attempt to ward off the chill of the creeping night, now felt like a suffocating cocoon. I rolled over, the synthetic fabric of my bag rustling loudly in the confined space. The sound was deafening. I waited for Derek to groan, to tell me to shut up and go back to sleep, or to throw a stray sock at my head. Nothing. "Derek?" I whispered, my voice thick with sleep and sounding incredibly small. The silence that answered me was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of my brother's voice. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet. Earlier in the evening, The backyard had been alive with the rhythmic, pulsating chorus of cicadas and the occasional chirp of a tree frog. Now, it was as if someone had thrown a heavy wool blanket over the entire neighborhood. The insects had gone dead silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, or even just at the edge of them, you know what that sudden silence means. It means something is moving out there. Something bigger than a frog. Something that makes the smaller creatures hold their breath in terror. I reached out a blind hand toward where Derek had set up his sleeping bag. My fingers met only the slightly damp, cold floor of the tent. I swept my arm further, patting the ground frantically. The sleeping bag was entirely flat. It was empty. A sudden, icy spike of adrenaline pierced through my lingering exhaustion, instantly sobering me up. My heart gave a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. I sat up quickly, banging my head against the sloping canvas wall of the tent. I ignored the sting, frantically feeling around in the dark. Derek's flashlight was gone. His Game Boy was gone. His shoes, which he had neatly placed near the door, were nowhere to be found. He had left me. The realization washed over me in a wave of profound, 8-year-old indignation mixed with a rapidly rising tide of panic. My older brother, the mighty Boy Scout, the intrepid wilderness explorer, had clearly decided that the lumpy ground of our own backyard was too much to handle. He must have woken up an hour or two ago, quietly packed his things, and sneaked back into the glorious, air-conditioned sanctuary of the house to sleep in his own soft bed. I looked toward the front of the tent. The twin zippers were pulled tightly together at the bottom center of the door flap. He had been polite enough, or perhaps cautious enough about the mosquitoes, to zip the tent back up after he abandoned me. Jerk, I thought, pulling my knees to my chest. Suddenly, the tent didn't feel like a fun canvas fortress anymore. It felt like a trap. It felt incredibly flimsy. The walls were just millimeters of woven fabric, separating me from the vast, dark expanse of the neighborhood and the dense, sprawling woods beyond it. Without Derek's steady breathing and taller, stronger presence beside me, my imagination began to run rampant. Every shadow cast by the moonlight, playing through the leaves of the oak trees outside, morphed into a lurking shape. I made a swift executive decision. My brief, illustrious career as a camper was over. I was going inside. I didn't care if Dad made fun of me in the morning. I didn't care if Derek called me a baby. I wanted the security of 4 solid drywall walls, a locked deadbolt, and the comforting hum of the refrigerator. I wrestled my way out of my sleeping bag, the static electricity making the hairs on my arms stand up. I crawled toward the front of the tent, my hands patting the floor until I found my sneakers. I didn't bother tying them. I just shoved my feet into them, crushing the heels down. I reached out, my fingers fumbling in the dark until they found the cool metal pull tab of the zipper. I intended to throw the flap open, sprint across the dew-soaked grass, and pound on the sliding glass door until someone let me in. But as I gripped the zipper, a sudden, inexplicable hesitation paralyzed me. What if something is out there? It was a childish thought, the kind of irrational fear that tells you a monster is under your bed or hiding in the closet. But in that moment, in the suffocating silence of 3 a.m., it felt incredibly real. The primitive, instinctual part of my brain, the lizard brain that kept our ancestors alive in the dark, was screaming at me to be careful. Instead of ripping the door open, I pulled the zipper up slowly, agonizingly, inch by inch. The metallic snick, snick, snick of the teeth separating seemed to echo like gunshots in the quiet night. I only opened it about 6 inches, just enough to create a small triangular window to the outside world. I pressed my face against the rough nylon, bringing my eye to the gap, and did a cautious, innocent peek outside to check if the coast was clear. The backyard looked entirely alien. The comforting, familiar landscape of my childhood was transformed by the pale moonlight into a stark, monochromatic wasteland of deep grays and ink-black shadows. The massive oak trees at the edge of the woods looked like skeletal giants, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. About 30 feet away, Dad's heavy iron fire pit sat in the center of the lawn. The fire had died out completely hours ago, leaving only a faint, angry red glow from a few stubborn embers buried deep beneath a layer of white ash. And then, my eyes adjusted to the darkness around the fire pit. Someone was sitting there. My breath caught in my throat, choking me. I froze, my hand still gripping the zipper pull so tightly my knuckles ached. It wasn't Derek. Derek was a lanky 12-year-old. This figure was massive. It was a grown man. He was sitting perfectly still in one of the cheap white plastic lawn chairs Mom had dragged out earlier that evening. The chair looked comically small beneath his bulk. He was silhouetted against the faint glow of the dying embers, a hulking shadow against the night. I couldn't make out his face, his clothes, or any defining features. He was just a void of darkness, a terrifying intrusion into the safe sanctuary of our property. For a wild, desperate second, my brain tried to rationalize the impossible. "It's Dad," I told myself. "Dad came out to check on us. He's just sitting by the fire, making sure the embers don't catch the grass on fire." But the silhouette was wrong. Dad was tall and lean. This man was broad-shouldered, thick and slouching with a predatory stillness. And if it were Dad, he would have heard the zipper. He would have turned around. He would have called out my name, told me to go back to sleep, or asked if I wanted to come inside. This man didn't call out. He didn't move. He just sat there. And with a sickening, plunging feeling in my stomach, I realized he wasn't looking at the fire pit. He was facing the tent. He had to have seen me. Even in the dark, the movement of the tent flap opening, the pale flash of my face appearing in the gap, it was impossible to miss. He was sitting there, cloaked in the darkness, watching me watch him. A tiny, pathetic gasp escaped my lips. It was barely a sound, just a sudden intake of air, but in the dead silence of the yard, it felt like I had shouted through a megaphone. Panic completely overrode my rational thought. I didn't scream for help. I didn't burst out of the tent and run for the house. Instead, I did the most childish, instinctual thing possible. I tried to hide. I yanked the zipper back down with a harsh, loud zip, sealing the small opening. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, kicking my shoes off in the process, and threw myself back into my sleeping bag. I pulled the heavy synthetic fabric entirely over my head, curling myself into a tight, trembling ball at the very back edge of the tent. I lay there, completely paralyzed, breathing in the stale, hot air of my own exhales. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribcage that I thought it might bruise the bone. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing with every fiber of my being that I was back in my bedroom, safe beneath my Star Wars comforter. "It's a dream. It's just a nightmare. You're asleep. Wake up. Please, just wake up." I repeated the mantra in my head over and over, trying to force myself to wake from a reality that was entirely too real. I waited for the sound of my dad's heavy footsteps on the back patio, the click of the porch light, the booming authority of his voice demanding to know who was in our yard. I waited to be saved. But no salvation came, only the silence. And then the silence broke. Scrape. It was a sharp, distinct sound, the unmistakable noise of plastic legs dragging across uneven grass and dirt. The man had stood up. I stopped breathing entirely. My lungs burned, begging for oxygen, but I didn't dare make a sound. I strained my ears, listening so hard that the blood rushing through my veins sounded like a roaring river. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and muffled by the thick summer grass. They weren't moving toward the woods. They weren't moving toward the house. They were moving in a slow, calculated arc directly toward the tent. I was shitting bricks. Absolute, unadulterated terror had hijacked my nervous system. I couldn't move my arms or legs. If he tore through the tent right then and there, I wouldn't have been able to put up a fight. I was completely at his mercy, a mouse trapped in a canvas box while a hawk circled overhead. The footsteps stopped. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I entertained a fleeting, desperate hope that he had walked past, that he was just cutting through the yard to get to the street. Then, the ambient gray light inside the tent suddenly darkened. I opened my eyes, peering out from the small opening at the top of my sleeping bag. A massive, towering shadow had fallen across the right side of the tent wall, blocking out the moonlight. The silhouette of a man's head and shoulders was projected sharply onto the thin fabric. He was standing right outside. He was inches away from me. If I reached out my hand and pressed it against the nylon wall, I would touch his leg. Please, I prayed to a God I only half understood from Sunday school. Please, make him go away. I'll never be bad again. I'll do all my chores. Just make him leave. I thought that if I stayed perfectly, absolutely still, maybe he would think the tent was empty. Maybe he had seen Derek leave earlier. Maybe he thought we had both gone inside. I tried to make myself as small as possible, trying to sink into the hard dirt beneath me. Dink. The sound was tiny, sharp, and metallic. It was the sound of a metal tab hitting another piece of metal. The zipper. He had taken hold of the zipper on the outside of the tent flap. My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. Zip. The zipper moved downward. It didn't rip open violently. It moved with an agonizing, taunting slowness. The person on the outside was pulling it down millimeter by millimeter, savoring the intrusion. Zip. Zip. It moved down perhaps 3 inches, just enough to create a small, dark vertical slit in the entrance of the tent. I was backed up against the rear wall, my knees pulled tightly to my chest, my hands gripping the edge of my sleeping bag like a shield. My eyes were locked onto the front flap, wide and unblinking, burning with the strain of staring into the darkness. The zipper stopped moving. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow remained draped over the side of the tent, motionless. I didn't understand what he was doing. Why stop? Why not just open it all the way? I couldn't help it. The human urge to know, to see the threat, overrode the instinct to hide. I turned my head just slightly, adjusting my angle to look toward the bottom of the tent door. There's a small gap at the bottom of most cheap camping tents, right where the 2 zippers meet the track at the very base. It's a structural flaw, a tiny opening where the teeth don't fully seal, usually leaving a hole about the size of a golf ball. I had never noticed it before that night. It was insignificant, until it wasn't. Pressed flush against the outside of the mesh screen, positioned perfectly in that tiny unzipped gap at the bottom of the tent, was a single eye. It was looking directly at me. The moonlight caught the glistening white of the sclera, illuminating it starkly against the surrounding blackness. The pupil was blown wide, a dark, fathomless pit locking onto my exact position in the dark. He wasn't searching the tent. He wasn't looking to see if anyone was inside. He knew exactly where I was. He was looking right into my face. I couldn't scream. The terror was so absolute, so suffocating, that it completely paralyzed my vocal cords. My mouth opened in a silent, jagged gasp, but no sound came out. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, locked in a stare with a predator who was relishing my fear. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, separated by a thin piece of mesh, staring at one another. Then the skin around the eye crinkled. The corners of the eye turned upward, the flesh bunching tightly beneath it. He was squinting. He was smiling. A massive, unseen grin was stretching across his face in the dark, stretching so wide that it forced his eye into a crescent moon of horrific delight. He was enjoying this. He loved that I was terrified. The metal tab clinked again. Zzz. The zipper slowly dragged down another inch. The slit widened. The spell of paralysis broke. The primal, sheer terror finally found its way out of my chest, tearing up my throat like shards of glass. I opened my mouth, filled my lungs, and unleashed a scream that tore the fabric of the quiet suburban night completely to shreds. The scream that tore out of my throat didn't sound human. It was a raw, jagged sound, stripped of any articulation, born from the absolute deepest well of primal, evolutionary terror. It felt like it was ripping my vocal cords to shreds, but I couldn't stop. I screamed so hard my vision swam with black spots. The reaction from the other side of the nylon was instantaneous. The heavy, suffocating stillness broke violently. The shadow draped over the side of the tent snapped backward. I heard a sharp, surprised grunt, a deep, guttural intake of breath from the man outside. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. Panic, pure and unadulterated, turned my limbs into frantic pistons. I scrambled backward, desperately kicking out of my tangled sleeping bag. My bare heel caught the thin aluminum frame of the tent pole, kicking it with such force that the entire right side of the canvas dome collapsed onto my shoulder. I didn't care. I just kept pressing myself backward, trying to phase through the back wall of the tent to get as far away from that tiny unzipped gap as physically possible. Outside, the heavy, thudding sound of boots tore through the wet grass. He was running. The sound of his retreat wasn't stealthy. It was a chaotic, panicked sprint. I heard the sickening crunch of dead branches snapping as he barreled blindly into the dense brush of the woods bordering our property. Then, salvation arrived in the form of blinding artificial light. The heavy-duty, twin-bulb halogen security light mounted above our back patio flared to life, triggered by a switch inside. The sudden illumination pierced through the thin fabric of the tent, turning the oppressive gray interior into a stark, blinding yellow. Almost simultaneously, the heavy glass sliding door of our house was thrown open so violently that I heard the track rattle. "Hey!" It was my dad. His voice was a booming, terrifying roar of absolute paternal fury. I had never heard him yell like that before. It wasn't the voice he used when we broke a window or tracked mud onto the carpet. This was the roar of a man who realized his territory had been breached, a primal warning designed to frighten and destroy. "Hey, get the hell away from there!" I heard his bare feet slapping against the wooden planks of the deck, followed by the heavy, rapid thud of him sprinting across the lawn. "Dad!" I shrieked, my voice cracking, tears streaming down my face in hot, embarrassing sheets. "Dad! Dad! Dad!" "Leo, I'm here! I'm coming!" The remaining distance between the house and the tent was closed in seconds. Suddenly, the front flap of the tent was seized by two large, frantic hands. The zippers, which the man had so painstakingly pulled down mere millimeters at a time, were violently ripped upwards in one swift, tearing motion. The canvas parted, and there was my father. He was wearing his gray sweatpants and a white undershirt, his chest heaving, a baseball bat clutched tightly in his right hand. His eyes were wide, scanning the collapsed interior of the tent before locking onto me. He dropped the bat into the grass and fell to his knees, crawling halfway into the tent to grab me. "I got you, buddy. I got you," he panted, pulling me out of the tangled mess of my sleeping bag and crushing me against his chest. He smelled like sleep and sweat and absolute safety. I buried my face into his shoulder, sobbing so violently my entire body was convulsing. He scooped me up effortlessly, standing up in the yard. He spun around, holding me tight against him, scanning the edge of the woods. The halogen light illuminated the first few rows of trees, casting long, sharp shadows, but beyond that, it was a wall of impenetrable black. "Where did he go, Leo?" Dad demanded, his chest rumbling against my ear. "Which way?" "The woods," I choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward the dark tree line behind the fire pit. "He ran in the trees." Dad stood completely still for a moment, his eyes narrowed, staring into the darkness. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. I think for a second he considered grabbing the bat and running in after him. But then he looked down at me, feeling me shaking against him, and his priorities shifted back. He wasn't a vigilante. He was a father, and his son was terrified. "All right, we're going inside." Right now. He carried me across the lawn with long, purposeful strides. The distance that had seemed so vast and terrifying an hour ago vanished in seconds. We reached the patio, and he practically threw us through the sliding glass door. My mom was standing in the kitchen, her face pale, holding the cordless house phone with white-knuckled intensity. The bright overhead fluorescent kitchen lights were jarring after the darkness of the yard. "Tom, what happened? Is he okay?" she asked, her voice bordering on hysteria. She rushed over, dropping the phone onto the island counter and wrapping her arms around both of us. "Someone was out there, Laura," Dad said, his voice grim and low. He set me down on a bar stool, but kept a heavy, protective hand on my shoulder. "Someone was at the tent. Call 911 right now." Mom didn't ask any more questions. She lunged for the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the 3 digits. It was then that I noticed Derek. He was standing in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, wearing his pajamas. He looked incredibly small, his face drained of all color. He realized exactly what had happened. He had woken up uncomfortable, decided to abandon the campout, and snuck back inside, leaving the door unlocked behind him. He had left me out there alone, completely vulnerable. Our eyes met for a brief second. I expected to feel angry at him, to yell at him for leaving me, but I was just too exhausted and terrified to care. Derek looked away, looking thoroughly ashamed, and slowly walked over to stand near Mom as she spoke frantically to the dispatcher. "Yes, my husband chased him off. No, we didn't get a good look at him. Yes, our 8-year-old son was in the tent. Please, hurry." Dad walked over to the sliding glass door, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. He then moved through the house, checking every window, making sure the latches were secured, pulling the blinds tight. The house, which had always felt so open and welcoming, was suddenly being converted into a bunker. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers washed over the vinyl siding of our neighbors' houses, reflecting brightly off our front windows. The silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the sharp squawk of police radios and the heavy slam of car doors. Dad let them in. 2 officers, looking entirely too awake for 4 in the morning, stepped into our foyer. Their heavy leather duty belts creaked with every movement. They brought a sense of clinical authority into the house that finally made the panic start to recede, replaced by a dull, aching numbness. One officer, a younger guy with a buzzcut, stayed in the kitchen with Mom, Derek, and me. The other, an older, broad-shouldered cop, took Dad outside to the backyard. I watched through the kitchen window as 2 powerful beams of light from their heavy maglights cut through the darkness of our lawn. They swept the area around the fire pit, then moved to the collapsed tent. I saw the older officer kneel down, shining his light exactly where the man had been crouching, exactly where that single eye had peered through the gap. They then moved toward the tree line, sweeping the dense brush where the man had disappeared. Inside, the younger officer knelt down to eye level with me. He had a small spiral notepad and a click pen. He smelled strongly of coffee and peppermint. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "Your mom tells me you had a bit of a scare out there tonight. Can you tell me what happened?" I nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. I told him everything. I told him about waking up and finding Derek gone. I told him about the man sitting by the fire pit. "Did you get a look at his face, Leo?" the officer asked, his pen hovering over the paper. "What was he wearing? Was he tall, short?" I shook my head, frustration mixing with the lingering fear. It was too dark. He was just a shadow. He was big, bigger than my dad, and he was sitting in the white chair. "Okay, that's helpful," the officer said, writing something down. "And then what did he do?" "He walked over to the tent," I whispered, the memory causing a fresh wave of goosebumps to erupt on my arms. "He stopped outside, and then he pulled the zipper down, just a little bit." The officer's friendly demeanor hardened just a fraction. He glanced up at Mom, who was covering her mouth with her hand, suppressing a sob. "Did he say anything to you?" "No," I replied. "He just looked at me. Through the little hole at the bottom, I saw his eye. And then he smiled. That's when I screamed." The officer closed his notepad. "You did the right thing, Leo. Screaming was exactly the right thing to do. You were very brave." I didn't feel brave. I felt like a coward who had hidden under a blanket, but I just nodded. About 20 minutes later, Dad and the other officer came back inside. The older cop took off his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We found some crushed grass near the fire pit, like you said," he told Dad, keeping his voice low, though I could hear every word, "and a clear trail of broken branches and disturbed brush leading deep into the woods out back. Whoever it was, he took off in a hurry. We've got a patrol car driving through the adjacent neighborhoods on the other side of the trees, keeping an eye out for anyone on foot. But frankly, if he parked a car on a cross street, he's probably long gone by now." "So that's it?" Dad asked, his voice tight with frustration. "Some creep comes into my yard, tries to get into my son's tent, and he just gets away?" "We'll increase patrols in this area for the next few weeks," the officer assured him. "I suggest keeping your doors locked and maybe installing some motion sensor lights facing those woods. We'll file the report, but without a physical description, it's difficult." The police left shortly after, leaving our family in the stark, exhausting reality of the aftermath. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright finally crashed, leaving me completely depleted. My entire body felt heavy, like it was filled with wet sand. "Come on," Mom said softly, stroking my hair. "Let's go upstairs. You're sleeping with us tonight." I didn't argue. I climbed into my parents' massive king-sized bed, slipping between the cool, high-thread count sheets. Mom lay on my left, Dad on my right. Derek, much to his unspoken relief, was allowed to drag a pile of blankets onto the foot of their bed. Even surrounded by my entire family, behind a locked bedroom door in a locked house, I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, the image burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. The stark white of the eye, the blown-out pupil, the sickening crinkle of flesh as the smile formed in the dark. I lay there for hours, staring up at the slow, rhythmic rotation of the ceiling fan, listening to the synchronized breathing of my parents. When the sun finally began to rise, turning the sky a pale, bruised purple before breaking into a brilliant orange, I felt a tiny fraction of the tension leave my body. The night was over. The monsters were supposed to retreat when the sun came up. But as I lay there in the morning light, I realized something profound and terribly sad. Later that morning, Dad went out into the yard and dismantled the tent. He didn't ask Derek to help him. He folded the canvas aggressively, shoved the aluminum poles into their bag, and put the whole thing on a high shelf in the garage. He dragged the fire pit to the side of the house and covered it with a tarp. In less than an hour, all evidence of our little backyard campout was erased. But you can't unring a bell. I looked out the kitchen window at our sprawling green lawn and the wall of dense leafy trees bordering it. For 8 years, that backyard had been my kingdom. It was where we played tag, threw baseballs, and caught fireflies. It was an extension of my home. But staring at it now in the harsh light of day, the illusion was shattered. The property line wasn't a magic barrier. The neighborhood wasn't a fortress. The woods were no longer a place of adventure. They were a vast, shadowy curtain, and behind it, terrible things were waiting, watching, and smiling in the dark. I thought the worst was over. I thought the morning light had washed the nightmare away, reducing it to a terrifying anecdote we would eventually stop talking about. I had absolutely no idea that the man wasn't finished with me, and that in just a few short weeks, he would step out of the shadows and into the broad daylight. The rest of that summer was defined by the sharp, heavy clack of newly installed deadbolts. In the immediate aftermath of the backyard incident, my childhood home underwent a paranoid metamorphosis. Dad spent an entire Saturday morning at the Home Depot, returning with heavy-duty locks, window dowels, and blinding motion sensor floodlights. My parents tried to hide their anxiety, but I noticed the way Mom double-checked the doors every night and how Dad started keeping his wooden softball bat right next to his side of the bed. We didn't play in the backyard after dark anymore. For the first few weeks, I was a ghost. I suffered from violent night terrors, waking up convinced that the shadow had slipped past the new locks and was standing in the corner of my room waiting for me to open my eyes. But time is a ruthless eraser. As July bled into August and August cooled into the crisp onset of September, the terror slowly began to recede. The police never found anyone. The floodlights never triggered. By the time Labor Day weekend rolled around, the event was neatly filed away in my mind not as an ongoing threat, but as an isolated, terrifying nightmare. Then school started. I attended St. Jude's, a traditional Catholic elementary school a few miles from our subdivision. The rigid structure of the day and the suffocating scratchiness of our mandatory navy and plaid uniforms provided a welcome, mundane distraction. There was no room for nighttime stalkers in a brightly lit classroom smelling of floor wax and sharpened pencils. Because the school was situated on a small plot of land sandwiched between the church and a residential area, our playground was just a massive, cracked concrete slab. It was enclosed entirely by a towering 10-foot-tall chain-link fence. On the far end of the yard, that fence ran directly parallel to the public sidewalk of Elm Street, a moderately busy 2-lane road. It was late September, and the weather had turned into a beautiful, crisp autumn afternoon. During our 30-minute post-lunch recess, the concrete yard was a chaotic blur of shrieking, running children. I was playing a high-stakes, sprawling game of infection, a brutal variation of tag. "Get him! Leo's heading for the fence!" one of my classmates yelled. A pack of 3 infected kids pivoted and sprinted in my direction. I needed a breather. The rules of our game dictated that if you were physically touching the chain-link fence bordering Elm Street, you were on base and could not be tagged for 10 seconds. I put my head down and bolted, slamming face first into the chain-link fence. I wrapped my fingers around the cold, diamond-shaped metal wire, gasping for air. 1, 2, 3, I started counting out loud, watching my pursuers skid to a halt a few feet away, groaning in frustration as they waited for my timer to run out. Behind me, Elm Street was relatively quiet, but then a voice cut through the ambient noise of the playground. "Hey!" It didn't come from the yard. It came from directly over my shoulder. I stopped counting. Still gripping the fence, I turned my head. Standing on the public sidewalk less than 2 feet away, with only the metal chain link separating us, was a man. He was painfully ordinary. He wore a faded zip-up windbreaker, dark jeans and a baseball cap pulled low to block the midday sun. He was holding a folded newspaper. "Hey there," the man repeated, taking a half-step closer. The kids chasing me lost interest and ran off to find someone else, leaving me entirely isolated at the perimeter. Every stranger danger lesson I had ever been taught flashed in my mind, but the ingrained instinct to be polite to adults took over. "Hi," I mumbled, taking a slight step back. "Sorry to bother you while you're playing," the man said casually, pointing down the street with his newspaper. "Do you know if there's a post office anywhere down this way? I think I got turned around." A cold, sinking sensation suddenly blossomed in my stomach. The air around him felt unnaturally heavy. "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. "We aren't supposed to talk to people outside the fence." I shifted my weight, preparing to jog back into the safety of the playground crowd. "That's a good rule," the man said softly. He stepped right up to the chain link. He reached up and curled his fingers through the metal diamonds, mirroring the exact way I had been holding it moments before. He tilted his head up slightly, letting the bright autumn sun hit his face. I didn't recognize his strong jaw or his deep-set eyes. And then he spoke again. "Your name's Leo, right?" The world entirely stopped spinning. The shrieking kids, the passing cars, the rustling wind, it all dropped out into a ringing, deafening silence. The blood drained from my face. He knew my name. My brain desperately tried to rationalize it. Maybe he's a parent. Maybe he heard the other kids yell it. But as I stared into his eyes through the gaps in the fence, the primal lizard-brain terror from the tent roared back to life. It was his voice. It was the exact same low, unhurried cadence I had heard whispering in the dark backyard. This wasn't a random drifter. He had found me. "No," I lied, a pathetic, trembling squeak. "My name isn't Leo." The man stared at me for a long, agonizing second, and then, slowly, the skin around his eyes began to crinkle. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, pulling into a wide, familiar, horrific smile. It was the smile of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey in broad daylight. He leaned forward, pressing his face so close to the metal that I could smell the stale scent of peppermint and sweat. "You don't remember me, do you?" he whispered. The paralysis broke. I spun around, my rubber soles slipping on the concrete, and I ran. I sprinted as if the ground were on fire, plowing through a group of girls playing jump rope. I locked eyes on Mrs. Gable, an elderly recess chaperone in a yellow safety vest, and shrieked her name. I crashed into her, burying my face in her cardigan, sobbing uncontrollably. "Leo, what's wrong?" she gasped. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. I just pointed a trembling finger back toward the Elm Street fence. "A man! The man from my backyard! He's at the fence!" Mrs. Gable squinted through her glasses toward the perimeter. Mr. Harrison, another teacher, jogged over to see what the commotion was. I forced myself to look back. I looked at the stretch of chain link where his fingers had gripped the metal, where he had smiled that terrible smile. The sidewalk was completely empty. He had vanished the moment I turned my back. "I don't see anyone, buddy," Mr. Harrison said gently. "He was there!" I screamed, hysterical. "He knew my name. It was him!" A quiet boy from my class named Tommy stepped forward. "I saw him," Tommy mumbled. "There was a guy talking to Leo. He walked away really fast down the street when Leo ran." That was enough. Mrs. Gable blew her silver whistle, 3 sharp blasts signaling an emergency lockdown. The chaos organized into anxious lines, and we were quickly marched back inside the heavy metal doors of the school. I was taken to the principal's office, shivering uncontrollably while they called the police and my mother. Sitting in that sterile office, a suffocating realization pressed down on my chest. This man hadn't just stumbled upon my tent by accident. He had studied me, and somehow, over the last month, he had tracked down exactly who I was and where I spent my days. When Mom burst into the office 20 minutes later, her face pale with absolute terror, she grabbed me and held me tighter than she ever had before. "I've got you, Leo," she whispered. "We're going home." But as she led me out to the car, my eyes darting frantically to every parked vehicle and shadow, I knew the awful truth. We could lock the doors and turn on the floodlights, but the illusion of safety was permanently gone. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark anymore. He was out there in the daylight, and he was hunting me. The drive home from St. Jude's that afternoon was the quietest 20 minutes of my entire life. My mother kept the car radio off. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of our Honda Odyssey so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. Every time we stopped at a red light, I watched her eyes dart to the rearview mirror, then to the sidewalks, scanning the faces of every pedestrian waiting at the crosswalks. The safe, predictable geometry of our American suburb, the strip malls, the cul-de-sacs, the manicured public parks, had been instantly transformed into a hostile landscape. When we pulled into our driveway, Dad's car was already there. He had left work in the middle of the day. A dark blue police cruiser was parked on the street in front of our house, its radio squawking in the quiet autumn air. The next few hours were a grueling repetition of the night in the tent, only stripped of the dark and replaced by the stark, sterile reality of a police investigation. 2 detectives sat in our living room. They didn't look like the uniformed patrol cops who had responded to the backyard incident. They wore cheap suits and carried thick manila folders. They asked me the same questions over and over, their voices gentle, but their eyes sharp and analytical. They asked about the man's windbreaker, the color of his baseball cap, the exact words he used. "He said my name," I repeated, sitting on the sofa with my knees pulled to my chest. "He said, 'Your name is Leo, right?' And then he smiled and asked if I remembered him." One of the detectives wrote something down, exchanging a heavy, meaningful look with my dad, who was pacing the length of the living room rug like a caged animal. "We have units sweeping the blocks around the school," the detective said, addressing my parents. "We're pulling the security footage from the bank on the corner of Elm Street and the gas station 2 blocks down. If he walked away from that fence, he had to cross through one of their cameras." But the chilling reality of police work in the early 2000s, long before every house had a Ring doorbell and every pocket held a high-definition camera, was that people could simply vanish. And that is exactly what the man did. The security cameras at the bank captured nothing but the glare of the afternoon sun on passing cars. The gas station footage was too grainy to make out any faces. The police dusted the chain-link fence at the school for fingerprints, but between the textured metal and the thousands of children who touched it daily, they pulled nothing useful. The man in the windbreaker had dissolved back into the ether, a phantom who had stepped into the light just long enough to prove he was real before slipping back into the shadows. For the next 6 months, my life was heavily, suffocatingly supervised. My parents essentially placed me on house arrest. The concept of walking to a friend's house down the street was completely eradicated. I was driven to and from school every single day, escorted directly from the passenger seat of Mom's car to the heavy glass doors of the building. Recess at St. Jude's was permanently altered for me. My teachers were instructed not to let me out of their sight, and I was forbidden from going anywhere near the Elm Street fence. Derek, carrying a heavy burden of guilt for leaving me in the tent that first night, became my permanent shadow at home. If I went upstairs to get a toy, he followed me. If I sat on the porch, he sat on the steps. Our entire family operated in a state of exhausting hypervigilance. Every strange car that idled a little too long on our street, every wrong number that rang our landline, sent a shockwave of anxiety through the house. We lived in a beautiful, upper-middle-class neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people moved to raise their kids in safety. To be practically chased out of our own community, held hostage in our living room by the sheer terror of an unseen predator, was a profound injustice. It was a hellish, paranoid winter. Eventually, though, the ice began to thaw. Humans are incredibly resilient creatures. We cannot hold our breath forever. As weeks turned into months and months bled into years with no further incidents, the invisible grip on my throat slowly loosened. The extra deadbolts remained on the doors, and the floodlights still illuminated the backyard with blinding intensity. But the terror faded into a dull, lingering caution. I grew up, I went to high school, I learned to drive. The phantom at the fence slowly retreated to the back of my mind, joining the ranks of bad memories rather than active threats. I am a grown man now. I live in an apartment in a different city, miles away from that sprawling suburban backyard and the Catholic school on Elm Street. To most people, I am completely normal, but trauma leaves a permanent watermark on your psyche. Even now, if I'm walking down a busy street and a stranger makes unexpected eye contact, my heart rate spikes. If I go camping with friends, I can never bring myself to sleep in a tent. I will always sleep in the locked cabin of my truck. I still check the locks on my doors twice before going to bed. The part that truly haunts me, the part that keeps me staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., isn't just the fear. It's the absolute sickening mystery of it all. I look back at that night in the backyard with the analytical mind of an adult. That man didn't just stumble upon my tent. He sat by the fire pit in the dark, watching. He waited until my brother left. He crept up to the canvas and unzipped that tiny, inch-long gap at the bottom to look inside. Why? Was he checking to see if I was asleep? Was he checking to see if I was alone? What would have happened if I hadn't screamed? What would have happened if my dad hadn't left the sliding glass door unlocked? Would he have pulled that zipper all the way up? And the school? Why risk approaching me in broad daylight, separated only by a chain-link fence? It wasn't an abduction attempt. The fence was 10 feet high and there were dozens of kids around. It was a psychological game. It was a flex of absolute dominance. He wanted me to know that my sanctuary was an illusion. He wanted to look me in the eye and say, I know exactly who you are and I can get to you whenever I want. The scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed. The scariest monsters are the ones wearing windbreakers, reading the morning paper, and blending perfectly into the background of a Tuesday afternoon. I survived. Thanks to a burst of primal panic and my father's quick reaction, I'm alive today. But whenever I think of that man, his deep-set eyes, his unhurried voice, and that horrific, crinkling smile, a heavy, nauseating thought settles in my stomach. I escaped him, but men like that don't just stop. They don't just give up and go away. I have to live with the sickening, terrifying reality that while I got away, he likely just moved on to the next subdivision, the next backyard, the next canvas tent. And it makes me physically sick to wonder if, somewhere else in the dark, he was finally successful.